Great. Yeah, thanks to you for inviting me to come and speak. This has been a really great experience and a great weekend. Learned so much about building that bridge between architecture and neuroscience and thinking about ways I can go back to New York and bring some of those ideas into our work. Before I get into the presentation, Fred already kind of mentioned a bit about our organization, but I can tell you a little bit more. We are coming up on 125 years of existence. We're Van Allen Institute. We began as an architecture school over a century ago, focused on the Beaux Arts style. Since then, I would say within the past like 20 to 25 years, we've begun to focus a bit more on what you would call creative placemaking. So projects that are happening in the public realm in different cities. We're based in New York, so that's where most of our work is, but we've been working all over the country, usually trying to find ways to not just revitalize urban spaces, but to take approaches that are more community-oriented. And here we have our mission. We believe that design can transform cities, landscapes, and regions to improve people's lives. So every project that we take on, we hope that it'll have that sort of transformative effect. So I've given you some highlights here. The Red Steps, the TKTS booth in Times Square, down to Rebuild by Design. We helped organize the competition that the Obama Commission or the Obama administration launched after Hurricane Sandy devastated New York. At the top left, we have Governor's Island, decommissioned military installation that's now a great public space in a park accessible to the public. And below the Mississippi Delta, we did a project a few years ago called Changing Course. We worked with municipalities around that region to try to rethink what the future of the Delta will be and what sort of form communities should take to help communities adapt to threats like climate change and sea level rise. So everything that we do, you can see we work at very different scales, but ultimately it's always about not just changing a space, but doing it in a way that gets people to really rethink what the role of public spaces and public architecture could be in making a community better. And it's really in that context that we started to get more into cognitive science and trying to understand what that body of knowledge can bring to the work that we do. We host design competitions, research initiatives, and public programs all the time. And usually there's a cycle that those things go through. We put out an RFP, several teams apply. There's usually a interdisciplinary focus. We'll do what we call like a research project or summit at the start where we get communities together with city leaders and architects and planners to talk about what the problems are on the ground and how people are relating to whatever issue that we're trying to address through the project. And then we'll have a public program at the end of it, usually an exhibition, right? So that's the cycle that it goes through. It's like RFP, bring people together to understand what's actually happening on the ground, and then take the findings, the final results of the project, and open it up to the public for review. It's a fine process. It's been very rewarding for us, but we've been really curious to see if we start asking this question, how can cognitive science inform better investments and design choices in the public realm? What would that process start to look like? How does it change the RFP? How does it change that research phase specifically? And then when you open up the doors to the public and say, look at what these designers have done, look at how great your community could be, how do you actually communicate, in this case, what benefits cognitive science actually brought to those design choices or not? But before we jumped into all that, we kind of had to acknowledge that we weren't the first people to ask this question. This is kind of where our perspective comes from as an organization and also informs the way that we've tackled this going forward. So here I just have this quote, is attributable to Christopher Alexander. What we know about the habitability of environments is pitifully thin and leaves us with more questions than answers. We know what has not worked retrospectively, and we can point to some existing conditions that create problems. Right? So that's just an acknowledgement of the problem, dated 1976. Going forward, we see that this was taken into academic programs throughout the country. You have Pennsylvania State University, University of Wisconsin, programs that were kind of bubbling up, kind of like the same scale of ANFA, like-minded scientists and architects getting together to find ways to bridge this gap between their two disciplines. But then ultimately it kind of dissipates. The sophisticated architect pays lip service to the man environment relationship and then goes right on with what he was doing anyway, right? And so when we kind of produce these projects, we always have this in mind, right? It's like architects and planners, they don't have to use this insight to develop what they do. And so if we're trying to bring this into a process, like we are gonna have to find some creative way to engage those architects, right? Whether it's finding architects who are already amenable to this way of thinking or pairing them in the interdisciplinary context with scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists who actually understand the content. So I want to highlight two projects pretty quickly to give you a sense of kind of how we've been using this in our work or pursuing it through our work. One is a project that we did called Shore Decor. It's a design competition that we launched with the city of West Palm Beach to renovate a strip of waterfront in their downtown. And the second is a project that we did exploring the connection between urban form and addiction, called Ecologies of Addiction, that was spearheaded by a team in London. So Shore Decor, like I said, that came on the back of a creative placemaking project that we pursued with West Palm Beach. So really what they wanted to do was revitalize this strip of waterfront close to downtown, maybe tear down a parking garage or repurpose it that was also on the site. But it was all about taking this investment they had to change the actual form of the space while also kind of re-engaging it, getting people to become more aware of its existence and also creating some opportunities for them to kind of go and explore and recreate and lounge, so on and so forth. We took this as an opportunity to add a cognitive layer to the project. So on top of the design competition, we put out a call for researchers to see if they couldn't come up with some sort of a pilot study that could investigate how bringing people to the waterfront could actually have a positive impact on well-being. The team that actually responded to the call was spearheaded by Jenny Rowe, environmental psychologist at the University of Virginia, who came up with a design for a tactical intervention on the waterfront that would be built on these principles that she calls restorative fascination. The hope would be that through the intervention, you would, one, draw people to the waterfront, two, get them to stay, three, encourage them to have an experience that she calls restorative fascination, which she defined as soft fascination with surroundings, psychological distance from demanding tasks, and that experience would in turn influence health and well-being. This is just a detail, sort of what it looked like. Some of the interventions elements were green planters and bamboo, which you can see. Fascination frames, which were these pieces of art that had historical scenes that relate to West Palm Beach, printed on like a transparent plane, and then locked in this frame. Shades, tables, and seating, all movable, and colorful art pieces, which are just big, colorful blocks of wood that one could sit on or just move around and admire. So it's pretty much tactical urbanism, but kind of given this new purpose to see if it can't be used and applied toward promoting health and well-being. And the study's design, I can just walk you through the steps really quickly. There were walking tours that they ran over 3 days in the first week of January 2017. There were 23 different participants, and each participant did the tour twice. Once through the intervention site with the tactical intervention in place, and one without the intervention in place. There was also behavior mapping that was done at the same time, so they wanted to see not just what was happening to the people who were moving through the intervention, but for people who weren't actually participating in the tours at all. I think one of the more interesting, useful parts of the projects were the development of metrics to try to, one, assess what was actually happening to people as they moved through the intervention, but also give the city of West Palm Beach an idea of what does it mean if we want to create a space with health and well-being in mind. So the key metrics were around access and visibility, emotional well-being, and physiology. So the physiology, they used Microsoft bands, wearable tech to measure galvanic skin response, skin temperature, heart rate, and heart rate variability. With emotional well-being, they were interested in mood, sociability, belonging, place quality, and inclusion. And then with visual access, they were really concerned with, because of where the site was located, are people able to actually see and access the site? When they get onto the site, what else can they see when they're there? And ultimately try to connect that with these other feelings of emotional well-being, physiology, and this sense of belonging. So the notable results were that there was a perceived change in stress, social trust, and perceptions of belonging, quality of place. All of those increased, and they were statistically significant. Hedonic tone, which is synonymous with happiness, and arousal were positive, but they weren't statistically significant. As far as physiology and visibility were concerned, there was no noticeable change, and neither of which were statistically significant at all. The outcomes, which I think we were most interested in, was that these recommendations, or a series of recommendations based on that experience, went to West Palm Beach, which they could use to inform their master plan going forward. So this was just one site that they wanted to look at, but as they're changing that area of downtown going forward, the idea was that they could take some of the metrics and some of the tools that they learned through this experience and create other pilots and other studies along the way. Now, Ecologies of Addiction, the second project that I want to share. This was started from a very simple question, or not simple, it was easily stated and very difficult to investigate. How might urban form and organization influence addictive behaviors? It came from a partnership with Imperial College London, where they were really focused on smart city tech. And they were just thinking about what are some new and inventive ways we can use technology to understand how people are living in the city. And this was circa 2014, so those questions were not even that sophisticated. There's like, we have apps now, like what can we do with that? Collaboration between, the project was a collaboration between a neuroscientist, 2 landscape architects, and an artist. And they tried to come up with some novel way to use a smartphone app to actually assess what is happening as people at different, threat is the wrong word, but everyone has a different relationship to the possibility of addiction. And they wanted to use the tool to assess in real time what people along this different scale of susceptibility to addiction were actually experiencing as they moved through the built environment. So they took our big question, which was how does city form influence addiction, and they broke it down to 2 smaller ones. One is how can smartphones improve existing knowledge of how city dwellers are affected by nature? And they broke it down to 3 key ideas: the type of interaction, the dosage, and real-world assessment. So they wanted to get outside of the lab. They wanted to assess how people were responding to nature in the city in real time. They wanted to get a sense of, nature is a big concept, like what does that even mean? So they narrowed it down to hearing birds sing, a sight, a view of the sky, a view of trees, and a view of water. And then ultimately dosage. They wanted to see if, in a city, you can't necessarily get full immersion to nature, so can even brief interactions have a meaningful impact? And then connecting it back to addiction, they asked, can we better understand the impact of urban environments and populations vulnerable to addictive behavior? Kind of alluded to this in what I was saying before. But they zeroed in on this concept of trait impulsivity and the idea that people who are more impulsive seem to have a greater susceptibility to addiction. The methods were as follows. So the overall scheme behind the study was this idea of ecological momentary assessment. So they used the app as a way to support or develop a panel data set, essentially, where respondents would interact with this app and they would give an assessment of how they were feeling and what they were seeing, if they had any access to nature at all throughout a day. They participated for 7 days, and there were 7 assessments during the day. There were 108 participants over the course of the study, and there were 3,013 different completed assessments. They had a validated and reliable measure of well-being, and they also had a validated and reliable measure of trait impulsivity. So what they found at the end was it's actually pretty exciting. The brief interactions with nature, they actually can have a noticeable impact on well-being. With water, it was insignificant, but it was significant in the case of trees, sky, and hearing birds sing. And there's also a positive correlation with the interaction lasting throughout the course of the day, right? So if you checked in the morning and you had a positive, or you had an encounter with the tree, then not only did well-being go up, but it sustained itself throughout the course of all 7 assessments. With impulsivity, they found that people who rated higher on the impulsivity scale were actually more susceptible to these effects. So if you see on this graph, we have like 6 different reactions built out. It's like as you go up on the impulsivity scale, your response to interactions with nature seems to be a bit more positive, unless you kind of hit the tail end, where I guess maybe you are so impulsive that no interaction with nature is actually going to improve well-being. And the outcomes for this study were the team throughout the course of this process have been speaking with people at the Greater London Authority to try to figure out ways to scale up their study or other questions of which the technology could be applicable. And they've actually launched the second phase of the project this year, which I can share the link with people. I really encourage you to download. If nothing else, it's kind of a fun diversion to check in every day and see, check in with yourself and see, do I see a tree? Can I hear a bird singing? Which all of that brings us to kind of the major challenges that we faced in trying to pursue these projects. So, and they're not insignificant. The two biggest are sample sizes and duration of the studies, and they're connected. So, as I mentioned before, we're kind of grafting this pursuit onto our existing model of placemaking, which means like the timelines at which we're able to do these projects, and as a consequence, the sample sizes that you're able to build up are severely limited. So, in both cases, both of the researchers said, yeah, we really could have used, several more months to do this. But the reality is, in the case of West Palm Beach, they were ready to start testing and redeveloping the site right away. So there was no real opportunity to spend 2 or 3 years trying to research this question. They wanted something that would help them understand how they were going to activate a space that they had already chosen to renovate already. Funding opportunities, again, it's a different shade of the same stick. So because we're using a grant that was usually given to a transportation authority or a city of, a Department of City Planning to support this, it's not like you're going to be able to get $150,000 to $300,000 for a research project. Usually the amounts of money available are much smaller, and of course that changes the number and the quality of people who want to participate in these research studies. And then lastly, city leadership. So in order to get any of these projects off the ground, it's really important to have a city leader who believes in it. With West Palm Beach, that's definitely what we had with the mayor. And she's really worked with us and other organizations to try to draw a straighter line between public health and urban design investments. But if you don't have that leadership, it's really hard to figure out how at all you can try to build this bridge between urban design on one side and then cognitive science and insight as to how people are affected built environment on the other. Thanks. That's the end of the talk.
All right, time for one question. Let's take it right here.
So I spent the summer living in London, and I was just wondering, did you guys look at any built environment elements like access to like pubs? Like when I loved London, but I was astounded by how much alcohol was part of the culture there, just from the built environment. Like there's a pub on every corner, people are drinking in parks. Did you guys look at anything like that with the impulsive people?
No, I remember that question coming up. Yeah, it's like how many people are spilling out of a bar as they're getting this assessment. Yeah. Yeah. They had some background questions that they gave to people who participated. So they asked questions like, everything was based on key demographics, obviously, like age, race, income. But they did ask, like, how often do you go out at night? When you do, like, how much are you drinking? How much are you smoking? So that was factored into it. They didn't really parcel that out of the results so much, but yeah, they did have that thought. Cool. Thanks.